is Jen Marlowe, and the name of the event, or today's event, as you know, we called it Troy Davis, the Human Face of the Death Penalty. And I'm imagining that a lot of people are in this room for different reasons, but some folks, I'm imagining, probably got involved in Troy's case in one way or the other, whether it was signing a petition to the Georgia Board of Pardons and Parole asking them to commute Troy's sentence, whether it was coming to any number of rallies and vigils that we had here in Seattle over a number of different years, and especially in the lead-up to his execution. I think Seattle was one of the communities around the states that were really took Troy's case very personally in a way. And today is really an opportunity to talk not only about Troy's case, which we will get the chance to talk about a little bit today, but also Troy Davis, the human being. And the human being, of course, who had a family who loved him dearly, and who had friends, and a network of friends that actually spanned all across the globe, who he managed to stay in very close personal touch with. Troy just wrote back to almost every person who wrote to him, no matter how many hundreds and then sometimes thousands of letters he got. So it's an opportunity not just to look at Troy and his family, although that's what we're focusing on, but of course we can imagine that if Troy Davis, a death row inmate, was a human being with a family, with friends, with relationships, then of course that's a window into every other human being who's on death row in our country. So I hope we'll be keeping that in mind even as we're focusing on Troy. And just to introduce myself briefly in terms of my connection to the issue, I first learned about Troy's case myself in 2007. And I was watching Democracy Now!, which I watch somewhat religiously, and saw this amazing woman speaking on Democracy Now! Who clearly, even before I figured out what she was talking about, who she was, I was like, oh man, this woman is a force of nature. And this woman was Martina Davis-Correia, Troy's older sister, closest friend, and staunchest advocate. And she was talking on Democracy Now! This was July 2007, because Troy had just survived the first execution date, Georgia, the state of Georgia's first attempt to kill him. He had survived that execution date less than 23 hours before the execution was to take place. It was stayed. And Martina was talking about that. She was talking about Troy's case, and she was also talking about not only her struggle battling for Troy's life, because Martina was the reason why Troy's case broke through the media at all. Martina was the reason why Georgia didn't succeed in killing Troy in 2007 when they first intended to. But at the same time, Martina was also battling for her own life. She'd been diagnosed with breast cancer in 2001. At that time, when she was diagnosed, the cancer was stage 4. It had already metastasized so far that her liver was covered in breast cancer tumors. And she was the single mom of a 6-year-old little boy. And you'll hear more about him later. And she was told then, which was March 28, 2001, that she had approximately 6 months to live. So she was fighting, and when I was hearing her speaking, that was 6 years later, it was 2007, talked about this double struggle for her life and for her brother's life. And I wanted to know more. I wanted to learn more about this brother that she was fighting so hard to save. So I started the internet, of course, the tool for all these different issues that when we know to dig for information, we can find it, even when it's not being presented to us. So I started to dig. The first thing I found was a report that Amnesty International had just put out, because they had just taken on Troy's case. And the report was called, Where is the Justice for Me? And so I started looking into Troy's case, found another website with his address in prison, wrote him a letter. As I mentioned, Troy writes back, got a letter back, and that's how my friendship with Troy began, which eventually extended to the Davis family, and to my having the opportunity to meet Troy several times, to visit him, and to be there and to stand with the family on the grounds of the prison in Jackson, Georgia, the night that Troy was executed. So I will talk more about all of that throughout the afternoon, but I wanted to start with a video that I made, which was I filmed the footage my first time that I was in Savannah. And I had come to Savannah because Martina and I were beginning the process of working on a book which would be the story of her double struggle. for her brother's life and for her own life. And she took me to the crime scene. She took me to the scene where Officer Mark McPhail was shot and killed, the crime that Troy was convicted of committing and was sentenced to death for. And so what I want to show you is the heart of it is Martina taking me through the crime scene and explaining what happened that night, and then there's also other footage from other sources that are woven in. But it gives a little bit of an overview of the case and of exactly what we mean, what Amnesty means, what all these organizations mean when we said there was too much doubt. And when we talked about that slogan, too much doubt, caught on and spread. And this video does a little bit of work towards unpacking what that means. So the video, of course, was made before September 21st. The video was made during this window of time where it was very clear that an execution date was imminent and was going to be set, and we were, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but during the period of time where we were very hopeful that we would be successful in our clemency campaign and asking the Georgia Board of Pardons and Parole not to allow an execution to proceed when there is so much doubt. Who you're seeing behind me, of course, is Troy with his family, and behind him, to your left, that's Virginia Davis, his mother in the orange shirt, Ebony, his youngest sister in the green, that's Martina next to Ebony, Kim, the third child, and then the young man in the green shirt, kind of crouched down, that's Martina's son, Dejon. He's about 13 when this picture was taking place. And you'll hear more about Dejon in a moment. So Troy got a number of photographs each year that he was allowed to take in the prison, with the prison Polaroid. So on special occasions and special visits, Troy would have the ability to have a picture taken. When you go to visit Troy, when you went to visit Troy in prison, you couldn't bring a camera with you, you couldn't bring a cell phone in. The only thing you're allowed to bring in with you is a bag of quarters for the vending machine. So that, and the Davis family had a whole amazing ritual when they went to visit Troy, and they knew, which junk food, Troy liked, and how many seconds to microwave the burger from the vending machine, and what, it was a whole ritual. And the few times that I was able to visit Troy with his family, the thing that was so amazing to me was that somehow this family was able to transform, Troy and his family was able to transform concrete and barbed wire and guard towers into warmth and humanity, which one can imagine in the midst of death row is no small or easy feat. Just a few examples to talk about this family, examples of things that happened long before the fight for Troy began. Because we'll hear a lot about this family's fight for Troy, but this family has a deep history of fighting for justice, starting with Virginia, Troy's mom. I didn't realize this until my second or third trip to Savannah, when Virginia started talking to me about being involved in the sit-ins in Savannah, Georgia, during the civil rights movement. She was one of the students that was sitting at lunch counters in the effort to desegregate them. And she was actually injured in some of the riots that happened, some of the race riots that happened during that period. One time when I was interviewing Martina for the book, and I asked, well, so Martina, what's your earliest memory of standing up to injustice? And I expected her to tell me, some incident that had to do with confronting racism as a young person in Savannah, Georgia. She was like, well, when they wouldn't let me play on the boys' baseball team, and I was better than the boys. And she told this whole story about how, she made the coach let her try out, and she was like, if I'm good enough, you can't keep me off the team. So, first they started her in first base, and she fielded first base, and then they, put her on second base in the outfield, and every position she was doing great, and then they put her in third base, thinking that that'd be too hard for her, but she fielded perfectly, and then she's like, well, you didn't try me on the one position I'm really good at, and I said, what's that? And she's like, pitcher. And then she pitched. So this is a little bit about who this family is, long before Red Coals went to the police station and said, Troy Davis is the one who shot Officer McPhail. That's Dejon. Martina's son, the young man that you saw in the green shirt, and that's Dejon as a 6-week-old. Quick question, can folks see the images okay? Would it be better if I turned those lights off?
No.
It's okay? Okay. And, you know, both Martina and Troy separately told me the story of the first time that, that Troy met Dejon. So Dejon was born very prematurely. I mean, he almost didn't survive. Martina almost lost him in utero several times. So his birth was something that, I think, obviously the birth of every baby is a joyous and beloved event, but it was an event that almost didn't happen. And Martina had to, you know, Dejon was in the hospital for about a month after he was born because he was so premature. And so this picture was taken at about 5.5 weeks, almost 6 weeks. So really, you know, as soon as Dejon was, you know, well enough and stable enough to be able to travel, first place she took him, put him in the car for about a 3.5-hour drive from Savannah to Jackson, Georgia, where Georgia's death row prisoners are, and brought her baby son to meet his uncle Troy. And you know, Martina and Troy are about 17 months apart, but they always talked about each other as if they were twins. And as being 17 months apart, Virginia pushed them in the stroller together. So they really did grow up in a way as twins, and they talked about how they could finish each other's sentences. So for Martina, she said, handing my baby to my brother was giving him this incredible gift. And it was like giving my brother a gold bar, she said. And Troy, holding this tiny baby, was scared to death. And he was scared, and I've heard this, you know, both from Troy and from Martina. He was like, you know, he was scared that, you know, just the pressure of his hands on this tiny, frail body would somehow damage him. He didn't know how to hold a newborn. There's not many newborns who come through death row in Jackson, Georgia. And so Martina handed him the baby, and Troy's like, look, but he's so little. You know, take him. And Martina walked away, and she's like, no, you take him. You hold him. And that's how the relationship developed. And Troy said about Dejon, and Dejon said about Troy that the relationship was not really one of nephew and uncle, but it was one of father and son. And in fact, when Dejon reached, you know, that age, the age where fathers sometimes have the talk with their sons, it was Troy who had the talk. And it was a visiting day, and that family made that round trip, 3.5 hours each way, 7-hour round trip drive, every other weekend. The entire time, the 20-year period that Troy was on death row. And actually, they came every week the first several years until Troy finally said, no, that's too much, that's too tiring, I don't want you to come every week, come every other week. So that's when they started coming every other week. So during one of those visits, Troy took Dejon to the corner of the, you know, there's probably the room was, if you go from the steps to the first row of chairs, maybe even a little smaller, that was the visiting area for all of the death row inmates who had visitors that day and their family. It was separate from where the general population had a bigger room to meet. So it was a very enclosed space, but somehow in that, Troy managed to find a corner of privacy with Dejon, and Martina explains it that all of a sudden she starts overhearing these little bits and pieces of, well, your body's going to start going through changes, and, you know, girls' bodies go through changes too, and us guys, these are the changes, you know, we go through. And Martina's like, what is he telling my son? But, you know, looking and seeing, is Dejon embarrassed? Is he blushing? And Dejon wasn't embarrassed, because Troy was basically letting him know, this is normal, this is what all of us go through, we go through it in different ways, this is what happened to me when I was your age, this is what you can expect. And they had that moment, again, there, surrounded by concrete, barbed wires, and guard towers. So you see Dejon a little bit younger than the story I just told you, a little bit older than the infant, and you see the relationship beginning to develop. When Dejon was about this age, 2, 3, 4, he didn't know where his uncle was, of course, and Martina struggled all the time of how, and like any parent does, right? How much information do you give your kid? You want to be honest with them. You want them to know the truth. You also don't want them to know more than what they're ready to handle, more than what they can handle. So when Dejon was a really little guy like this, Martina told him that his Uncle Troy was in a special school. That's why he couldn't come home with the family, because when they would be leaving the prison, and Dejon would say, come on, Uncle Troy, we're going home, come with us, and Martina would say, oh, sweetie, he's in school, he can't come home right now, but someday he will, and he'll come home with us someday soon. And as Dejon got a little bit older, and here he's about 6 years old, then, eventually Martina began to give him little more pieces of information. So eventually Dejon knew, he understood that his uncle was in prison, and that the family was working to prove that he was innocent so that he could get out of prison. But Martina didn't think he was old enough to really confront the reality that the state of Georgia was trying to kill his beloved uncle. She didn't think he was ready to know about what death row meant and what the death penalty meant. And she figured, she was trying to figure out when he would be ready and when he would be old enough. And of course, kids often figure things out far before we realize that they have. And the picture you're looking at right now is Dejon's about 6 in this picture, and that was his new puppy at the time named Egypt. And Dejon actually called Egypt his sister, which created some awkward moments in supermarkets when Dejon would loudly say things like, "Mom, why'd you leave my sister locked in the car?" and stuff like that. But Dejon loved Egypt very much. They, puppy and boy grew up together. And when Egypt was about 6 years old and Dejon was about 12 years old, so older than this picture, Egypt actually got hit by a car. And when Martina found her, and she was clearly very injured, and they took her to the vet, and Egypt's leg was broken in about 3 places. And Dejon, came with Martina to take Egypt to the vet. And this vet said, look, we can do a surgery to save your dog's life, but the surgery is going to cost $10,000 because the leg is so badly injured, and everything that will need to happen to repair it, and the physical therapy. And if you don't do the surgery, then really the only option is to put the dog asleep. And they could make the dog comfortable for the night, so Martina could have the night to think about what she's going to do, but then she'd have to make the decision the next day. So Martina was driving home, and Dejon was in the car next to her, and Martina's just thinking to herself, she loves this dog, and her kid loves this dog, but $10,000, where's she going to come up with $10,000? And there might just not be a choice. And she's not saying any of this out loud, but she's thinking this. She might have to put Egypt to sleep. There just might not be a choice. And as she's thinking all this, Dejon says, "Mom, are you going to put my dog to sleep the way they're trying to put my Uncle Troy to sleep?" And that's when Martina learned that Dejon knew far more than what she realized he knew. That not only did he know that his uncle was on death row and that the state of Georgia intended to kill him and was trying to kill him, but he knew about lethal injection. He understood that the method that in this country we use to kill our prisoners is pretty much the same method that we use to put down an animal. And as Martina told me the story, when Dejon said that, she looked at Dejon and he was just looking right at her. And she swallowed to keep, the lump in her throat from coming out her eyes. And at that moment, she just decided, all right, sell the car if I need to, second mortgage on the house if that's what it takes. I cannot let this dog be put to sleep because I cannot further traumatize my son, who's already clearly more traumatized and more aware than Martina knew. Fortunately, in Egypt's case, there was a very good second opinion that she sought out, and they were able to save Egypt's life without having to pay $10,000 to do it. But of course, at that point, Martina realized she needed to sit Dejon down and really tell him everything, because he was figuring out how to find out on his own. So from the age of 12, Dejon lived over his head, knowing that his mother was still very ill, and knowing that his uncle was slated for death. This is Dejon about a year ago. This picture was taken last May, so he was 16, and this is Dejon's little cousin, Kirsten, who was 3 and a half when this picture was taken. And Kirsten is Ebony's little girl. Ebony was the youngest sister in the family, and they're the only 2 kids of the younger generation of the Davis family. Ebony was also very close to her Uncle Troy, but her opportunity to have a relationship with him was very different than Dejon's. I explained to you about the visiting room that there was in death row, and how Dejon, you saw the picture of Dejon as a little guy, with his Uncle Troy. When Kirsten was about a year and a half, the state of Georgia, the Georgia Department of Corrections, took away contact visits from death row prisoners. We have all these terms, right? That sort of obfuscate what the reality is. So the term, so the terms was contact visits revoked, and twice a year they got special contact visits, but the rest of the time visits between death row inmates and their families and friends took place. Initially, there was like an iron mesh sort of a grate that was between the prisoners and their families that you had to kind of lean against and shout through, and then eventually that was replaced with plexiglass and phones. So what that meant for Kirsten is that she didn't have the opportunity, except for twice a year, to be held by her uncle, to sit on his lap, to be tickled by him. I mean, imagine trying to develop a relationship with a toddler when you can't touch the toddler, when you can't hug the toddler. But somehow, throughout that, Kirsten did, and Troy did manage to develop that connection to little Kirsten. And they had a little ritual. At the end of the visits, Troy would put his hand up on the plexiglass window on his side, and Kirsten would put her little hand up on the plexiglass window on her side. And then one day, the family always wrote letters to Troy and got letters from Troy. Kirsten decided that she wanted to write a letter to Troy too. Everyone else was writing letters to Uncle Toy, as she called him. So she wanted to write a letter to Uncle Toy. So her mom gave her, a crayon and piece of paper, and she drew her hand. She traced her hand, because that was their thing. And she sent the picture of her hand to her Uncle Troy, and Troy got the letter, and then he drew his hand. He traced his hand and sent that back to Kirsten. And Martina told me that Kirsten got the letter, and she was like marching around the living room, holding, "This is my letter from Uncle Troy." Very, very excited, very happy, and very, very proud. The events the start of the events, that was what you could say the beginning of the spiral of events that led to September 21st, happened on March 28th, 2011. You might remember earlier in the beginning when I was talking, I mentioned that Martina's diagnosis with stage 4 cancer, when she was told she had 6 months to live, that took place on March 28th, 2001. So Martina woke up on March 28th, 2011, feeling pretty good. That day was her 10-year anniversary as a survivor of breast cancer, when she had been given 6 months. She didn't know if she was going to live to see her son's 7th birthday, and it was almost her son's 17th birthday. So even though Martina had been in and out of the hospital a lot over the past couple months, and her health was deteriorating because her form of cancer was so aggressive that she was on chronic chemotherapy. I mean, it was treated as a chronic disease, so she'd been on chemotherapy at that point for now a solid 10 years as a preventative. So she woke up that morning knowing that it was her 10-year anniversary as a cancer survivor, and about an hour later, she got the call from Troy's lawyers telling her that Troy's final appeal had been denied by the U.S. Supreme Court. Troy had an evidentiary hearing the summer before, the summer of 2010, and the judge ruled against him, because unlike a retrial, if there was a retrial, then Troy's innocent until proven guilty again, right? And the burden of proof would have been on the state to prove beyond any reasonable doubt that Troy was guilty. But in the evidentiary hearing, the burden of proof was on Troy. Troy had to prove beyond any doubt that he had clearly established innocence. Well, in Troy's case, how do you clearly establish innocence? There was no physical evidence connecting Troy to the murder that DNA could overturn. There was only this collection of eyewitness testimonies, the vast majority of whom had recanted, but even though 4 of those eyewitnesses came, and I was at the evidentiary hearing, 4 eyewitnesses came and testified that they had lied when they originally implicated Troy because they had felt coercion and intimidation. Other witnesses came forth and said that the alternate suspect, Red Coles, that he had confessed to them. One that they had seen Red Coles pull the trigger. He had actually witnessed this alternate suspect commit the murder. But despite that, the judge ruled that those witnesses were not credible, although their testimony in 1991 apparently had been credible enough to sentence Troy to death. Now they were not credible. The law enforcement officials who testified that the investigation had been done perfectly and that there was no coercion, that there was no intimidation, the judge found that more credible and denied Troy. So then the appeals process started right after that, and March 28, 2011, that's when the Supreme Court denied that final appeal, which basically set into motion, paved the way for Georgia to be able to set Troy's execution date, which would be his 4th execution date. I mentioned the one in 2007 that got stayed 23 hours in advance. In September 2008, Troy came within 90 minutes. He had already said goodbye to his family. His family was already on the prison grounds in Jackson, Georgia, holding vigil, waiting for the execution. So 90 minutes before that execution was slated to take place, the U.S. Supreme Court stepped in and stopped it. And then a month later, in 2008, there was a 3rd execution date, and he came within about 3 days, the 3rd time. So this was now paving the way for the 4th execution date. That execution date likely would have been set March 29th, except for one thing. Georgia had lost its supply of one of the 3 drugs that's used in this lethal injection cocktail. Georgia at that time, and most states at that time, was using a drug called sodium thiopental as one of the 3 drug cocktails. Well, so the only domestic manufacturer of sodium thiopental had stopped manufacturing it, so now all these different states, they were all scrambling to get their supply of the drugs that they needed to kill their prisoners. And Georgia got a stash of sodium thiopental from a British pharmaceutical company called Dream Pharma that operated out of the back of a London driving school, a fly-by-night company, and didn't register it with the proper authorities. They basically kind of got it somewhat on the black market. And the DEA, the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency, found out about this and confiscated Georgia's supply of sodium thiopental, and also discovered that Georgia had sold some of its supply to other states, so went and confiscated other states. So all these states were in a scramble, how are we going to kill our prisoners now? And it took a while for them to work it out. Eventually, other states first, and then Georgia replaced sodium thiopental with a different drug called pentobarbital. Going back to Dejon's statement about Egypt, and about, are you going to put my Uncle Troy to sleep the way you're trying to put my dog to sleep? Pentobarbital is, in fact, how we put animals to sleep. So it's actually now not only a similar methodology, it's actually, we're now using the same drug that we used to put animals to sleep, to put our prisoners to sleep. So March 28th paved the way, but until Georgia sort of resolved this lethal injection issue, they couldn't set any new execution dates. But all the headlines of the paper was, execution date imminent, Savannah cop killer, about to be executed. The Savannah Morning News that got delivered on the Davis's doorstep every morning had, their editorial was, I'm paraphrasing, but somewhere along the lines of like, it's time already, he needs to be killed, was the paraphrasing. So Virginia, you see Troy with his mom, Virginia. Virginia is reading that editorial. She's seeing those headlines. She's hearing all the rhetoric. Even the human rights organizations that are rallying for Troy, they're also using that rhetoric, right? Because you need that to mobilize people. People don't get mobilized if you're saying, well, hopefully there won't be an execution date. They get mobilized because you're saying, this execution date is imminent, we gotta move now. But how does that feel to Troy's mother, hearing that for the 4th time now? Dejon came home one day on April 13th, 2 weeks after the Supreme Court set that date, And he came home, and as he always did, because he lived, Virginia and Martina and Dejon and Kim, Martina's sister and Troy's sister, all lived in the house together. So Virginia was the one who made Dejon breakfast every morning. And so Dejon came home from school, and as he always did, slammed the door to get a rise out of Grandma. And then when he didn't hear Grandma say, something like, boy, stop slamming that door, which she usually did, he called out, Grandma, I'm home. Now, Martina had just had a small procedure the day before for an ulcer she had related to the chemotherapy. So she was taking a nap. She was trying to take a nap, and she heard the door slam, and she heard Dejon say, Grandma, I'm home. And then she heard Dejon say again, a little bit louder, Grandma, I'm home. And by the time Dejon said for the third time, Grandma, I'm home, Martina was already getting up out of bed. And so she was already out of bed by the time Dejon ran into her room and said, Mom, I need help. I can't wake Grandma up. And Virginia had sat down in her chair when Martina went to take a nap about 45 minutes before Dejon went home and just slumped over and was gone. And there was no cause of death that was ever discernible. It was considered due to natural causes because they couldn't find if there was a heart attack or if there was a stroke. It was mild enough that a preliminary autopsy didn't show any signs of it. And Martina says that her mother died of a broken heart, and that Virginia died because she couldn't handle living through a fourth execution date. And that fourth execution date, of course, was set, and it was set on September 6th, after Georgia resolved its lethal drug issue on May 20th, but because that was so soon after Virginia's death, presumably that's why they didn't set Troy's date right away. They executed 2 other prisoners before Troy. Whether it was out of genuine compassion for the family or whether it was out of realizing how extra bad they would look if they were to set Troy's date right on the heels of his mother's death, they waited a few months. And then the date was set on September 6th, and the date was for September 21st. On September 21st, back up a second, all summer long, from the moment, or from March 28th really till September 6th, the whole work was really preparing for this clemency campaign, preparing for this full-out campaign to tell the Georgia Board of Pardons and Parole, you have the power to stop this execution. Unlike a court of law, unlike a court which has all these restraints, has all these procedural restrictions. All the appeals processes that happen. Well, appeals processes aren't set up, they aren't designed to do the correct thing. They're designed to do the right thing, right according to procedural process, not correct in terms of moral imperative. But the boards of pardons and parole, not being a court of law, had far more space to do the correct thing, to do the morally correct thing, rather than just what was procedurally right or procedurally correct. So Troy had his clemency hearing in front of the Board of Pardons and Parole on September 19th, 2 days before the execution date, and the board denied him clemency. We don't know why, because it's a closed process. There's no transparency. We know what happened in Troy's half of the hearing because his lawyers were in there, and they can tell us. We know that Dejon was one of the people who went in there to beg for his uncle's life. We know that the juror that you saw on the video also came and said that basically that it's not fair to us as jurors. Because we would have made a different decision if we had had the information. We did now. And she was one of at least 3 jurors who signed statements saying that they would not have sentenced Troy to death if they knew what they knew then. But the Board of Pardons and Parole is a political body. They're appointed by the governor. They can be reappointed to their terms or not. They have, many of them, political careers in mind. They are mostly former prosecutors, former law enforcement, and what we know is, or what we sort of learned from inside sources, is that it was a 3-2 vote, and Troy against Troy, so 1 vote. If one person had decided that there was enough reason for for Troy to be kept alive, enough doubt, enough reason, then he would have been. So the board denied him. That was 2 days before the execution, and then there was the 2 days where Troy could say goodbye to, he could put a list. Every time he got an execution date, he had to put a list together of the people to say goodbye to. So September 20th and September 21st were those goodbyes. The picture that you're seeing right now is right about 7 o'clock p.m. on September 21st inside the, there's an area right inside the grounds of the prison, pretty far away from the actual prison, pretty far away from the death house, where Troy would have been on death watch, because once the execution's a few days away, they take the prisoner out of the regular death row cells, they bring them to the death house, and then they stay in a special death watch cell where they're under 24-hour surveillance, because they want to make sure that the prisoners don't kill themselves or hurt themselves before they can be executed. And in fact, Troy called me once distraught a couple years ago because there was a prisoner who was to be executed who actually, even on death watch, somehow managed to slit his wrists and tried to kill himself, and he was rushed to the hospital in order to save his life, and his life was saved, and then when they determined that he was stable and well enough again, then they proceeded to execute him. That was Brandon Rhodes. And Betty, I don't remember, I got that call in the middle of rehearsal for There Is a Field, if you remember that. So Troy had said goodbye to his family, he'd said goodbye to his friends. His family went from the prison to a church across the street where we had organized a press conference, and there is hundreds, about 500 supporters at the church and several hundred more of us on the prison grounds. And just before 7, around 6:30, 6:45, the family moved from the church over to the prison grounds, and you can see everyone in a circle huddling and praying as the minutes, it's maybe 6:57, 6:58. The minutes are ticking to 7 o'clock. At this point, there had been these, sort of Hail Mary appeals for a stay. First to the Butts County Court, which is the county court where the prison actually was. Then when that was rejected, it went to the Georgia Supreme Court, then it went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and it hadn't yet been ruled on whether there would be a stay given. But 7 o'clock was about a minute away. Everyone was assuming that the execution was going to proceed at that time, and the praying and the singing and the pitch and the fervor and the intensity was rising and rising, and then all I can describe it as is a sound across the street that heard, the closest sound I could think of that it heard like is tanks invading a city. I mean, it had the rumble of tanks, and then the rumble erupted into a roar, and what we heard from the hundreds of protesters across the street was the roar, "Troy gotta stay." And then the roar erupted to all of us inside the prison yard that Troy gotta stay, Troy gotta stay. And then, of course, then there was all this, wait, no, it's not a stay, hold on, wait, we don't know what. Then this, all this confusion, all this panic, and what we learned was that it wasn't a stay, that it was a delay. And that the Supreme Court had asked for there to be a delay until they could rule on whether or not Troy got to stay. So then it turned into these hours and hours of waiting and waiting. And you can see we were not waiting alone. It wasn't just those of us coming to vigil and those of us coming to support Troy's family, but there was about 150 of these guys surrounding some of them, like you see here, in the full-out riot gear, others in less intimidating gear, but hundreds. It was an entirely militarized environment surrounding the pen. I mean, the protesters, we were all in a sort of roped-off pen right on the entrance of the prison grounds, and then there was the hundreds more across the street. These guys here were making sure that people across the street stayed across the street, and the few that tried to venture into the street were arrested that night. There was a SWAT chopper overhead, so in the midst of all this, you have that helicopter sound, cars with police dogs, just off the perimeter, highly militarized. And then there was the waiting and the tension, and it lasted from 7 to 8, from 8 to 9, from 9 to 10. And you can see here, in this picture, that's Dejon, and he's lifting up Kirsten. Because in the midst of this agony, and this tension, and this waiting, and this not knowing, and for Martina also not knowing, like, was Troy waiting all those hours strapped on the gurney? Or was he in his cell? Was he in pain? Martina not knowing how is he feeling, how is he doing, what's going on with my brother right now, the agony of that. But in the midst of that agony, in the midst of that tension, there was a little girl. And there was a little girl who needed to feel loved, and who needed to feel protected and safe, and who needed to laugh. And so despite the family's great pain, and it would have been perfectly understandable if the family couldn't really deal with Kirsten at that moment, right? There was hundreds of us who would have entertained Kirsten. There were hundreds of us who would have made sure that Kirsten was okay. It would have been perfectly understandable if the family at that moment just couldn't be the ones to address Kirsten's needs. But that's not who this family is. Their little girl needed to be loved and needed to play and needed to laugh, and they were going to make sure that in the midst of their pain, that she was going to have that. At around 10:30, the decision came down from the U.S. Supreme Court that there would be no stay. And I remember having a moment and turning to my colleague Laura Moore, who's the abolition campaign director for Amnesty International, trying to understand, like, so that means, like, is it now effective immediately? It begins? And she said, yeah, now. Effective immediately. Now they will begin the process of killing Troy. But of course, when you're standing there, you don't know the exact timing of everything that's happened. We had learned since then that Troy had not been strapped on the gurney for those 3 hours. He managed to be able to reach one of his lawyers, and he had been doing the waiting in his cell. So when we learned that the execution was proceeding, you're standing there and you're imagining, or maybe trying not to imagine, what's the moment that they're leading him from his cell into the death chamber? What's the moment that they are strapping him to the gurney? What's the moment that he's saying his last words? You don't really know any of that in that moment. You learn those details later when the prison releases them. During that waiting, during that period once we learned what was happening, but we didn't know the exact timing of it, I was standing with Laura. You can see Laura's she's the woman in the short hair and the glasses with the khaki pants and the brown blazer, and we were standing a few feet away from Martina. And let me mention, you see Martina there in a wheelchair. Martina was in a wheelchair because Martina had spent basically all summer in the hospital, very, very ill, fighting for her life. And essentially, Martina busted out of the hospital a few days before the execution so that she could be there with and for her brother. The most painful part for Martina of that summer in the hospital was the fact that she couldn't visit Troy all summer long. And she knew this date was coming. She knew that this date was upon us, and she hadn't been able to see him for months. And so the date was September 21st. On September 17th, Martina basically busted out of the hospital so she could be there with and for her brother, and she could visit him, and if it came down to it, that she would be able to say goodbye to him. But she was very, very weak. She hadn't stood or walked in months. And we're standing there, and she called Laura over, and she said, Laura, come here, I have to tell you something. And Laura and I sort of looked at each other like, at this moment, whatever it is that Martina's going to say, it's probably pretty damn important. And Laura walked over to Martina, and Martina grabbed the arm of the other woman. You see Laura, the woman with the pad and the Too Much Doubt poster under her arm, and she said, this young woman, her name's Monica. She drove here all the way from San Francisco by herself, to be here, to be with us. I want you to get her plugged in with the activists that are in California, with the movement that's happening. I want to make sure that she can get involved. I want her to be plugged in. So you see Laura and Monica, exchanging contact information. Where Martina, if you could follow Martina's gaze, she was looking directly at the prison. And I'm assuming by the expression on her face and the direction of her gaze, Martina is wondering at this moment, what's happening to my brother? She had taken care of the business, right? Monica and Laura, they're exchanging the info. Laura's getting Monica plugged in. Now her focus is back on her brother. We know what time this picture was taken because Scott Langley, the photographer, Amnesty volunteer who took it, had the timestamp. This picture was taken at 11:08 p.m. What we learned later was that what was happening to her brother at that moment, 11:08 p.m., that's the exact moment that Troy succumbed to lethal injection. So what was Martina doing at the moment that her brother was succumbing to lethal injection? I at that very moment, what was Martina doing? She was enlisting another recruit in the struggle to bring the death penalty down. At that exact moment, at the moment that Troy passed, she was making sure that the fight to bring down the system that took down her brother, that fight was going to continue and be stronger. And that fight isn't happening just in Georgia or just in the South. We might like to think that stories like what happened to Troy couldn't happen here, couldn't happen in our communities. But they can, and they do. We have the death penalty in Washington State. And I want to introduce my colleague, Sarah Kraft, because I want her to talk a little bit about what the situation here is in Washington State and what all of us can be a part of. The fight that Martina was recruiting Monica to join, it's a fight that needs all of us. So Sarah's going to talk a little bit about that, and then afterwards I've got, at the very end after Sarah talks, I do have two more very short video clips, one of Martina and an audio clip of Troy talking that I want to share as well.
Yes,